The VIP lounge at Club Elysium had a specific atmosphere at 2 a.m. It was a combination of expensive perfume, spilled top-shelf gin, and the quiet desperation of people trying too hard to look important. That was my office. Or at least, it was where I spent 10 hours a night standing behind an oak desk. I was 58 years old, and after decades of running my own establishments, I was wearing a black polyester uniform designed to make me blend into the wall. My shoes had cheap rubber soles that did not slip on wet floors, a far cry from the Italian leather loafers I used to wear. The bass from the main dance floor vibrated through the floorboards, matching the slow thud of my own heart. In this business, people remember your face when you are holding the keys to the kingdom, but they forget your name the second your bank account is frozen. I stood there, watching the crowd of junior executives and tech heirs spend their parents' money as if the night would never end. The cold winter draft from the front entrance swept through the lobby, every time the heavy doors opened, chilling my joints and reminding me of the passage of time. I had seen this cycle repeat itself for 30 years, the rise and fall of the city nightlife, and I knew that arrogance was always the first sign of a business about to collapse. Then Beatrice Barlow walked in. She did not just enter a room, she glided through it as if she owned the air rights. She was wearing a silver fox fur coat that probably cost $15,000, and her eyes were scanning the lounge for someone to humiliate. That night she chose me. She unhooked the clasp of her coat and threw it across the counter. It hit me square in the chest, heavy and smelling of cold air and expensive perfume. I caught it out of sheer reflex. "You dropped the hanger last week," Beatrice said, not even looking at my face. She was busy checking her reflection in the dark glass of the DJ booth. "If you ruin the silk lining of this coat, I will have the costs deducted from whatever tiny wage you earn here." I did not say a word. I simply tagged the coat with ticket number 777. I watched her walk away, her high heels clicking on the polished concrete floor, leaving behind a trail of heavy scent that smelled like a funeral home. She was joined by her friends, a group of wealthy socialites who treated the hospitality staff as if they were nothing more than automated machines designed to serve them. Beatrice was the wife of Richard Barlow, the CEO of Vertex Enterprises. His tech company had recently acquired a major portion of the commercial real estate downtown, making them the most influential couple in the city district. 2 years ago, I did not hold coats for people like Beatrice. I owned the Obsidian Lounge, which was the premier spot in the city. We did not let people like the Barlows in because they treated everyone around them like servants. I remember the exact night I denied Beatrice entry at the front door. She had arrived with a group of friends, demanding to be seated in the private area without a reservation, shouting at the hostess. The lounge was operating under a strict capacity limit of 120 people, mandated by the local fire department safety codes, and we were completely full. Beatrice tried to bypass the security rope, pulling a roll of $100 notes from her purse and waving it in the bouncer face, shouting that she would buy the building just to fire everyone. I stepped in, refused the cash, and told her that even if her husband owned the bank, she was not on the guest list. That was my mistake. I underestimated how much time a vindictive woman with unlimited resources has when she decides to hold a grudge. Within 3 months, the Obsidian Lounge was targeted. It started with anonymous complaints to the health department about structural leaks and rodent infestations. Then, a forged shutdown order was slipped under my door, bearing the apparent signature of the city inspector. My investors panicked and pulled their funding, fearing a public relations disaster that would damage their other business interests. I was forced into liquidation, losing my business, my house, and my savings. I was left with nothing but my knowledge of the industry. So, I decided to go dark. I dyed my gray hair, stopped wearing my expensive watches, and took a low-paying job at Club Elysium, the new favorite hangout of the Barlows. For 2 years, I have been a ghost. I have cleaned tables, stocked ice, and watched them celebrate their success. They had no idea that the silent man hanging up their coats was the same man they had ruined. They did not know I was keeping records, waiting for the right moment to strike back. I spent my shifts observing the layout, documenting every health inspection report, and studying the operational flaws of Club Elysium. I knew the building was old and the foundation had issues, But the corporate owners, Nexus Hospitality Group, ignored the maintenance to maximize their short-term profits, believed their success was permanent, just like Beatrice did as she laughed with her friends in the VIP section. She would drink her expensive champagne and talk about how she cleaned up the downtown district by getting rid of that trashy place down the street, referring to my old lounge. She had no idea I was standing just 5 feet away, restocking the glassware and memorizing every word of her confession. Every insult she threw at the staff was fuel for my planning. I was not angry, I was analytical. I knew that in business, as in chess, the person who reacts in anger always loses. I was playing a longer game, one that required patience, documentation, and absolute secrecy. I would wait until their confidence was at its peak before I pulled the rug from under them. I knew that the vanity which made them feel invincible would eventually become the very leverage I needed to dismantle their empire. Working under Donald, the general manager of Club Elysium, was an exercise in patience. Donald was a weak man who spent most of his shift hiding in his office, terrified of displeasing the corporate owners, Nexus Hospitality Group. He kept me around because I was reliable and understood the back-end systems better than he did. I managed the inventory spreadsheets, tracked the liquor deliveries, and fixed the POS software when it crashed. The other staff, like a young waitress named Grace, appreciated my presence. Grace was 23 years old, working double shifts to pay her way through law school, and she was the constant target of Beatrice Barlow's cruelty. Beatrice would snap her fingers at Grace, demand fresh lime wedges, and then fold a $1 note into an origami swan as a tip, leaving it on the table as a physical insult. I told Grace to keep her head down and let me handle the scheduling so she could avoid the VIP booths. I knew what it was like to be at the mercy of people who used their money as a weapon. I spent my dinner breaks helping Grace review her legal textbooks, pointing out practical applications of contract law that I had learned through years of business experience. Richard Barlow usually arrived 1 hour after his wife, surrounded by a group of sycophants from Vertex Enterprises. He was a cold man who did not yell but simply ignored the existence of anyone earning less than 6 figures. On a rainy Friday night, Richard walked past the coat-check desk and tossed his wet designer umbrella at my chest. He did not hand it to me. He simply released it in my airspace, assuming my body would react to catch it. I caught it. "Dry it off," Richard commanded, not looking at me. I stood there, holding the dripping umbrella. Richard paused for a second, squinting at my face. "You look familiar," he said, his voice flat. "Did you work at that garbage lounge down the street before it went under?" I looked down. "I am just the coat clerk, sir," I replied. He scoffed. "Right, that owner was a loser. Probably sleeping in a shelter now." He walked away to join his wife, laughing with his colleagues about the failure of local businesses. I watched him walk away, his expensive wool coat dripping water on the floor, and I felt a cold sense of clarity. I took the wet umbrella to the utility room. I did not dry it. I opened it and left it in the sink to drip. Then I pulled out my phone and logged into a secure database. For 2 years, I had not just been fetching coats. I had been investigating the corporate structure of Nexus Hospitality Group. I discovered they were carrying $4 million in high-interest debt and were looking to liquidate Club Elysium to avoid bankruptcy. I contacted my old business partners, Mr. Vance and Mr. Fletcher, who had also been burned by Richard Barlow in a previous tech deal. Richard had betrayed them during a merger 3 years ago, costing them over $1,500, zeroed in shares through manipulated stock options. We met in a quiet diner at 4 a.m. to discuss the plan. We formed a shell company called JHB Holdings and combined our resources. Over the past 6 months, we had quietly purchased the debt notes of the building from the bank at a 30% discount, paying $2,800,000 in cash to take full control of the mortgage. Furthermore, I used my access to the club inventory system to locate their primary supplier. In this state, liquor distribution is tightly controlled by a single distributor. I had Mr. Vance negotiate the acquisition of the regional rights for that distributor. As of Friday afternoon, JHB Holdings controlled the supply chain. I logged into the distributor portal using my administrator login and flagged the Club Elysium account. I changed the status to credit hold, delivery suspended. Without new deliveries, the club would run out of high-end alcohol within 24 hours. The trap was set, and the Barlows were about to walk right into it. I stood in the dark utility closet, listening to the hum of the ice machine. The logistics of the hospitality industry are simple. If you control the supply, you control the room. Nexus Hospitality Group had been neglecting their balance sheets for 3 years, relying on the high traffic of wealthy patrons to cover their operational deficit. They did not realize that their entire business was built on a foundation of unpaid invoices and leveraged assets. I had tracked every payment, every delay, and every interest rate hike. By purchasing their mortgage debt and their distribution contracts, we had essentially built a cage around their operation. Mr. Vance and Mr. Fletcher were more than happy to fund the acquisition, seeing it as the perfect opportunity to reclaim their losses and deliver justice to the man who had cheated them. The Barlows believed their social status protected them from the consequences of their actions, but the law does not care about social standing. It cares about contracts, debt, and signatures. I locked my phone, put it back in my pocket, and walked back out to the floor, ready to finish my shift with a polite smile. Knowing that every drink served brought them closer to the end of their reign, Saturday night arrived, and Club Elysium was packed for the Vertex Enterprises post-merger celebration. Richard Barlow had invited 150 guests to celebrate his company's latest acquisition. But the atmosphere in the lounge was turning sour. The club had run out of Dom Perignon and Grey Goose. Donald, the general manager, was sweating profusely in his office, screaming into his phone at the distributor. He did not understand why the deliveries had been blocked. I stood near the bar, watching the chaos unfold. Beatrice Barlow was waving her empty glass at the bartender, demanding her usual drink. When the bartender offered a cheaper brand, she threw a tantrum, calling the establishment a cheap motel. She was shouting loud enough for the nearby tables to hear, completely embarrassed by the lack of premium service she expected. The corporate guests from Vertex Enterprises looked uncomfortable, murmuring among themselves about the terrible management and the lack of quality drinks. They were boasting about their stock portfolios and complaining that the club was serving mid-shelf bourbon in empty, top-shelf bottles because the high-end inventory had run dry. My lawyer, Jessica, had spent the afternoon reviewing the documents I gathered from the city archives. I had found the original shutdown notice of the Obsidian Lounge from 2 years ago. Julian spent hours comparing the inspector's signature on the shutdown notice with legitimate documents from the city planning board. He noticed the signature was from an inspector who had retired 6 months before the notice was issued. Jessica confirmed that the signature of the city health inspector was a crude forgery, a direct violation of California Penal Code Section 470. We had traced the IP address of the anonymous complaint to a computer registered to Vertex Enterprises, specifically under Beatrice Barlow's account. This was proof of tortious interference and fraud. But that was not all. I also discovered that Club Elysium was running its entire reservation and inventory system on the proprietary database software I had developed and registered under federal copyright law, specifically 17 U.S.C. Section 106. The software, which I called LoungeFlow, utilized a custom queue hashing algorithm to optimize bottle service delivery and table rotation. The corporate owners had copied my code without a license, using it to run their venues. I had noticed my custom debug codes appearing in their system error logs during my night shifts. Confirming the theft, I decided to use my administrative access to make the Barlows' evening miserable. I logged into the digital seating program on my tablet. I flagged Table 1, the Barlows' permanent VIP table, as a low-priority service zone. This meant the orders from their table were automatically pushed to the bottom of the queue on the bar screens. Beatrice waited 30 minutes for a glass of sparkling water, while the tourists at the next table were served immediately. She was furious, shouting at Donald, who could only apologize and promise to look into the system glitch. The corporate guests from Vertex Enterprises looked uncomfortable, murmuring among themselves about the terrible service and the lack of quality drinks. Next, I went to the VIP balcony and placed a yellow caution tape around their favorite booth. I entered a maintenance ticket in the system, citing structural instability in the subfloor. When Richard Barlow marched up to his booth, he was stopped by Jack, the head bouncer, who pointed to the tape and explained that the area was unsafe. Richard had to stand near the bar for the rest of the night, his expensive loafers getting stepped on by the crowd, while his wife complained about her feet hurting. I watched them from the coat check window, smiling. They were standing in a building they thought they dominated, completely unaware that the floor beneath them had already been sold. The structural ticket I entered was a minor nuisance, but it served a larger purpose. It created a paper trail of mechanical failure that Donald would have to explain to the corporate board. In the meantime, I watched Richard Barlow try to maintain his composure. He was a man who defined himself by the deference of others, yet tonight he was being bumped by college students and ignored by the staff. His wife's voice grew louder, her complaints echoing over the music. She was demanding that Donald fire the entire tech team, convinced that the database issues were a personal attack. She was correct, of course, but she had no way of proving it. Every automated system they relied on was turning against them, converting their evening of triumph into a series of minor humiliations. I checked the inventory logs one last time to confirm the stock was depleted and prepared for the final phase of the plan. I knew that the real collapse would happen when they realized the law was no longer on their side, and that their wealth could not buy them out of a contract they had violated from the beginning. On Sunday morning at 9 a.m., I sat in Jessica's office. The mahogany table was covered with signed deeds, debt transfer sheets, and the official copyright registration certificates. Mr. Vance and Mr. Fletcher were present, looking pleased. Jessica handed me the final document. The bank had accepted our cash offer for the remaining mortgage note on 440 West Street, the Building Housing Club Elysium. JHB Holdings was now the official landlord of the property. Additionally, the liquor license transfer had been approved by the state board. Jessica explained that under state law, a commercial lease can be terminated immediately, without a cure period, if the tenant is using stolen intellectual property and forged government documents to operate the business, as it constitutes a felony and a material breach of the lease terms. Because Nexus Hospitality Group had defaulted on their interest payments and violated the lease's good moral character clause by using forged documents and stolen software, we had the legal right to terminate their lease immediately. I signed the paperwork using my full name, Julian Harrington. The signatures were verified by a notary, making the transaction legally binding and ironclad. I walked back to my small apartment, feeling a deep sense of accomplishment and prepared for the final confrontation. I spent the afternoon cleaning my best suit, preparing to take back what was mine. That evening, I returned to the club for my final shift. The staff meeting was filled with panic. Donald told us that the liquor supply was frozen, and the corporate office was facing a sudden legal emergency. He warned us to push the cheap house brands and keep the customers happy. At 10 p.m., the Barlows arrived with their usual entourage. They were wearing tailored tuxedos and designer dresses, chatting loudly and looking down their noses at the regular patrons. Beatrice looked exhausted and angry from the previous night, and she was clutching her silver fox fur coat. She marched up to the coat check counter and did not even look at me. She simply unhooked the clasp of her coat and threw it. She wanted to release her frustration on the easiest target she could find, which was once again me. The heavy fur hit me directly in the face. The metal clasp scratched my cheek, leaving a thin line of blood. "Oops," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with fake politeness. My hand slipped. "Hang it up and make sure you do not touch the pockets." I stood still, feeling the warmth of the blood on my skin. The silver fox coat lay on the counter between us. For 2 years I had tolerated the insults, the cleaning of their messes, and the arrogance. But the game was over. I did not reach for the coat. I looked Beatrice dead in the eye and said, "No." I stood tall, letting the silence settle over the room, watching the confidence drain from her expression as she realized I was not moving. Beatrice froze, her mouth slightly open. She looked around to see if anyone had heard. "Did you just say no to me?" she hissed, stepping closer. "I said no," I repeated, my voice calm and steady. "I will not hang up your coat." Beatrice let out a loud, screaming laugh. "Donald, get over here. This old clerk is malfunctioning." Donald rushed out of his office, his face pale and sweating. "Julian, what are you doing? Just hang up the coat and apologize." I looked at Donald. "I am not hanging up the coat, Donald," I said, "because as of today, I do not work for you." I took off my name tag and placed it on the counter next to the fur coat, letting it click against the wood. The silence that followed my statement was absolute. The music seemed to fade into the background as the surrounding patrons turned to watch the confrontation. Donald stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He had relied on my quiet compliance for 2 years, never questioning why a man with my experience was willing to work for minimum wage. Beatrice was trembling with rage, her face turning a blotchy red under the neon lights. She demanded that Donald call the police, claiming I was assaulting her with my attitude. I stood my ground, my hands resting flat on the counter. I felt the slow drip of blood down my cheek, but I did not wipe it away. It was a physical reminder of the cost of their arrogance and the receipt for the debt I was about to collect. The corporate guests who had arrived with the Barlows stood in silence, sensing that the dynamic of the room had changed completely. The coat check clerk they had ignored was no longer invisible, and the space they occupied felt smaller by the second. Beatrice pointed a finger at my chest. "Security, throw this crazy old man out of the building immediately." Jack, the head bouncer, stepped forward. He was a large man who had worked for me at the Obsidian Lounge before the Barlows ruined it. He looked at Beatrice, then at me. "I cannot do that, Mrs. Barlow," Jack said, crossing his arms. "What do you mean you cannot?" Beatrice screamed. "I am a VIP guest. My husband is the CEO of Vertex Enterprises." Jack looked her in the eye. "I take orders from the owner of the club, and that is Mr. Harrington." Richard Barlow pushed his way through the crowd, his face red. "What is going on here?" he demanded. "Who is this clerk?" I stepped out from behind the counter. "I am Julian Harrington, the owner of this building, the land, and the liquor license." I pointed to the mirror behind the bar. Grace, the waitress, pulled the cord, revealing the message written on the glass, "Check your access." Below it, the digital screen projected the corporate certificate of JHB Holdings. Richard's face lost all color as he recognized my name. He realized that the shell company that had bought their debt and cut off their liquor supply was owned by the man he had ruined 2 years ago. The crowd of onlookers gasped, and phones were immediately pulled out to record the scene. Richard tried to bluff, raising his voice to reassert control. He claimed that Vertex Enterprises had a team of corporate attorneys that would tie me up in litigation for 10 years, and that my claims were nothing more than a desperate stunt. I looked at him calmly. I explained that a federal copyright lawsuit under 17 U.S.C. Section 106 combined with state forgery charges under California Penal Code, Section 470 would result in a statutory injunction. This meant the club would be shut down by federal marshals before any trial even began. I handed him the paperwork, and he saw the official seals. He realized he had no leverage, and his legal threats were useless. The corporate associates who had accompanied him began to back away, whispering about the potential impact on their stock prices. I reached into my pocket and handed Richard the formal notice of trespass. "Your lease is terminated, and your corporate account is closed. You are banned from this property permanently." Richard looked at the paperwork, his hands shaking. He looked at his wife, who was staring at him in terror. "We can settle this, Julian," Richard stammered. "Let's go to the office and talk about a buyout." "I do not want your money, Richard," I said. "I want you out. I want you to leave this building immediately." I turned to Beatrice, pointing at the silver fox coat on the counter. "Pick it up," I said. Beatrice stared at the coat, tears of anger and embarrassment welling in her eyes. The crowd was filming the entire scene on their phones, the flashes reflecting in the mirrors. Slowly, she bent down, grabbed the coat, and clutched it to her chest. "Jack, escort them out the front door," I ordered. The bouncers, tall, silent figures who blocked the exits, stepped in and escorted them out. The Barlows were led out of the building under the gaze of their peers, their reputation destroyed in minutes. The lounge erupted in cheers and applause from the staff and customers. I turned to Donald, telling him he was demoted to assistant manager, but he could keep his job if he learned how to stand up to bullies. I promoted Grace to shift supervisor and announced a round of drinks on the house. I sat down in the VIP booth, the caution tape removed, and smiled. The house always wins. Check your access, sweetie. The physical sensation of sitting back in that booth was the first time I felt truly warm in 2 years. I watched the staff move with a new sense of energy, no longer burdened by the toxic presence of patrons who viewed them as subhuman. Mr. Vance and Mr. Fletcher joined me, raising their glasses in a silent toast. We had reclaimed what was stolen, not through violence or illegal sabotage, but through the precise application of commercial law and strategic finance. The Barlows would spend the next several years in courtrooms, defending themselves against forgery charges and copyright infringement lawsuits that would drain their Vertex Enterprises stock. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening to the music. The Obsidian Lounge was gone, but Club Elysium was mine. I was no longer the ghost in the machine. I was the owner. I opened my eyes, took a sip of my drink, and looked toward the door. The sign now read, "Be nice or get out." And that was a rule I intended to enforce. Real power does not need to shout. It works quietly in the background, keeping the systems running, while those who rely on arrogance eventually find themselves locked out of the very rooms they claim to own. I adjusted my collar, looked at the empty counter, and smiled as the bass rattled the glass in my hand, ready to start the next chapter of my life. It was a long, hard, and painful journey, but every single step along the way was completely worth it. The city nightlife would always go on, but from now on, it would be run on my terms.